Question: has the bill been now read a second time? Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. Another year and another bill to postpone the Northern Ireland Assembly elections. Mind you, it is worth noting that the last time we did this, something quite significant happened 5 days later when the Windsor framework negotiations were concluded. So let us live in a state of hope, tempered, as always, by experience. Can I begin by thanking the Secretary of State for introducing the bill in such a timely fashion. We support it. I have met no one who thinks that holding elections now would help resolve the difficulties that Northern Ireland's politics are currently in. But while we may be in agreement about the need for this bill, I don't think we should let this moment pass without acknowledging that the Assembly elected, 20 months ago, has still not yet been able to meet. And in any other democracy, anywhere in the world, that would be a cause of anger, not to say uproar, because the very essence of a democratic election is that the representative body should be able to meet and do its job. And I would just observe that Northern Ireland surely cannot continue to be the only place where this does not happen. I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for the discussions that we have had between us. It is a pleasure to do business with him. And as my predecessor, the Honourable Member for Hove, said just under a year ago, and I quote him, "It would of course be better if this legislation was not needed. Northern Ireland is a valued part of the United Kingdom, and restoring the Stormont Assembly and the Executive should be a priority for the government." Well, I know that it is a priority for the Secretary of State because he spent so much time negotiating with the DUP to try and find a way forward. And from the moment I took on this role, I have tried to support him and the government in that objective. And now, with the negotiations, it appears, having effectively concluded, we've come to the moment of decision. And I hope that the DUP will return to government. I think the DUP should return to government. And I say that for a host of reasons, above all because the people of Northern Ireland need to have their government back. The consequences of having no government for almost 2 years this time around, and of course previously for almost 3 years when Sinn Féin walked out of the institutions, are very serious for the people of Northern Ireland. As we know, the Assembly can't even elect a Speaker, so it can't meet. Difficult decisions are not being taken. The public finances are in a parlous state. When the flood struck last year and affected so many businesses and homes, there was no government instalment for people to turn to for help. None.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course I will give way.
When I was at home over Christmas, I took my uncle to the Cancer Specialist Centre at Belfast City Hospital. It was a very humbling experience to see the care and the dedication provided by the staff there in what is a world-leading facility. But the stresses and the strains were very clear: a lack of funding and a lack of direction, because when institutions and systems fail, people suffer. So this really has to be the last time that legislation like this comes before this House. Get it back up and running, or the Secretary of State with the Irish Government should find something else to sort it out.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that this is the moment to get the institutions back up and running, and I wish the person he referred to all the best with their treatment. The civil servants, of course, are left to make decisions that really ought to be made by elected representatives. And in the case of public sector pay, for example, with some workers not having had a pay rise for almost 3 years, it should hardly bear repetition. No decisions have been taken because there isn't enough money in the budget to do so. Now, that's why there was such a large strike last week, and I see that there's likely to be further industrial action coming towards us. And I think everyone now recognises, including the government, that that is not a sustainable position, and the proof on the government side is that in announcing the financial package, it identified money for public sector pay, although it is not currently being released until such time as the executive is restored. Now, if I may be really frank, I understand why the Secretary of State took that decision initially, but I must say to him that I think in relation to public sector pay, that moment has now passed, and that's why I called on him last week to release that part of the budget package so that the disputes can be settled, workers can get their pay increases, and public services can try to address the many, many challenges they face. I will, of course, give way.
Thank you for giving way, and he's making a very important point, because, of course, many public sector pay awards have been made, nearly 50 over the last year. And the only reason why the current one is not being made is because the Secretary of State is holding teachers, nurses, etc. as pawns in the game which he is playing, and the efforts he's trying to make to force us into a position to make a decision that he wants us to make and we don't wish to make.
Well, the honourable gentleman links the pay question to the stance that he takes in relation to the current difference of view that the DUP has with the Windsor Framework and the Protocol. I would say to him in return, it is equally true that if the DUP were to go back into government, then public sector workers would get their pay increase. And that's why I said a moment ago that I hope very much that that will be the case. Now, turning to the substance, I will, of course.
I thank the Shadow Minister for giving way. Shadow Minister, I'm aware from back home from the papers, from the TV correspondence, from media statements made by those in unions. They say very clearly, and I quote them, that the problem here doesn't lie with the politicians, with respect, it lies with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who has control of the money. He, in his own right, as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, could settle these claims for those in education, those in health and elsewhere. The monies are there. The unions say, let the Secretary of State do it. Has he heard the same story as I've heard? I've heard it in the news and the media.
Well, I have indeed heard the unions making precisely that point. And I have set out to the House today why I understood initially why the Secretary of State took that approach, but I do think that public sector workers should not continue to be held hostage to the failure thus far, and I hope that it will change very soon to solve this problem, which is why I am calling on the Secretary of State to release the funds now. Now, we need to be honest about how we got to the deadlock that the government's been grappling with, as indeed has the Right Honourable Gentleman for Lagan Valley as leader of his party. One of the many, many consequences of leaving the EU was that a decision had to be taken about what to do about trade across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, given that everyone agreed that the border had to remain open. There were not many things that everyone agreed on when it came to Brexit, but that was one of them. And everyone agreed that the EU needed to be sure that goods crossing that border complied with the rules of their single market. There was no escaping this. And the government decided that the answer would be the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, before I occupied this role, I was one of many people who argued that the implementation of the protocol would not work as originally intended in Northern Ireland, including for reasons that many in the unionist community had pointed out. And in fairness to Maros Sefcovic, he understood what the problems were and changed the EU's approach. And that is why I genuinely believe that the Windsor Framework represents a significant step forward. It's why we on this side of the chamber voted for it. Now, of course, detailed implementation will need to be worked through. That is another reason why the executive needs to return. But most businesses tell me that the Green Lane is working reasonably well. And as I said last week, the framework is here to stay. And I make no apology for reinforcing the point again today, because it will continue to be implemented by whoever is in government in Westminster. And anyone who thinks otherwise, with respect, has got it wrong, not least because any hope of negotiating future arrangements of benefit to Northern Ireland with the EU will depend on the Windsor Framework being implemented. Because if the UK were once again to renege on an international agreement it has signed, and it's happened before, there would be, for example, no SPS agreement reached or anything else, because trust would once again have been destroyed. absolutely destroyed. At the same time, of course, unlike the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland continues to enjoy ready access to both the UK and EU markets, which is a huge opportunity for jobs and economic growth in the years ahead. And these are the facts which nothing is going to change. Now, what the government has been doing, we all understand, is negotiating on measures it could take to reinforce Northern Ireland's position in the UK internal market. And the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley has wisely and repeatedly said, and I support him in this, that any agreement has to be acceptable both to unionists and to nationalists. And that has shown great wisdom. In addition, there is a financial offer on the table, which I think provides a basis for going forward. So after months of negotiation between the government and the DUP, now is the moment to decide whether to restore the institutions. Now, on the detail of the bill, and there's not much, I have just one question. In his press statement on the 19th of January, the Secretary of State said, and I quote, "I intend to introduce new legislation which will take a pragmatic, appropriate and limited approach to addressing the executive formation period and support Northern Ireland departments to manage the immediate and evident challenges they face in stabilising public services and finances." End of quote. Now, I take it from those words he was referring actually to another bill that he thinks might be needed if the current negotiations fail. Can he confirm that that is the case? I'm not asking for any further detail, although I hope, we all hope, that such a bill will not prove necessary because the institutions will return. Also, can the Secretary of State assure the House that as and when there is an outcome, indeed either way, he will immediately come to the House and make a statement? Oh yes, of course I will give way.
For giving way. Would he agree with me that he talked in the questions to the Secretary of State about Plan Bs and alternatives, but would he agree with me that any alternative to restoration of the institution is suboptimal and is also not the settled position of this House? All parties have as their primary policy position on Northern Ireland governance the restoration of the institution.
I agree 100% with what the Right Honourable Gentleman has just said, and he anticipates a point I'm just about to come on to make in my concluding remarks. And they are these, that Northern Ireland has come a long way since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998. It is unrecognisable in so many ways and for the better. And in all of my meetings, all of my visits, I've been so impressed and encouraged by the energy, the enterprise, the industry of those I have met who are working hard to build a new and better future for the people of Northern Ireland. And that really matters when we know that families in Northern Ireland, for example, have the lowest disposable incomes in the United Kingdom. And the longer there is no functional devolved government, the harder it will be for those businesses to seize the opportunities that are available anyway, including because of access to the EU market, because businesses that are thinking of investing don't like uncertainty. They want stability. They want to know there is a government in place. And so the absence of a government undermines the bright future that otherwise faces the people of Northern Ireland. And the basis of power sharing, which was at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement, including devolved government, was essential to the making of progress. And of course, although there have been bumps and difficulties along the way and periods of no government, a generation on from 1998, I simply want to echo the point the Right Honourable Gentleman has already made, that we cannot give up on devolved government. It is what we believe in this House. And it is the responsibility that all of us take on when we stand for elected office. We can't really have a system where any of us chooses to put conditions on the basis of which, if they're not met, we're not going to take part. That is not how a democracy works. As I'm fond of saying, we have to deal with the world as it is as we seek to change it into the world we would wish it to be. And it cannot be, surely, that politicians from all parties and all communities in Northern Ireland are somehow unable to come together to establish the Assembly, form an executive and get on with the task of governing. I will give way.
I'm very much enjoying the tone and the thrust of his presentation. Of course, he is dancing between a majoritarian and a power-sharing arrangement in his comments, and so they're not quite perhaps as aligned as he might suggest. But my question is this. This is not the first time that Stormont has been suspended. In the past, Sinn Féin refused to come back to the Assembly, as I understand, over concerns about the language. And the UK government has made steps towards that in more recent years. I'm just wondering then, would he support the UK government making measures towards the current impasse over the Northern Ireland Protocol as modified by the Windsor framework? Is that a position that he could support, alterations to that, which might be helpful to restoring power and alleviating some of the concerns of the unionist parties in Northern Ireland?
I'm grateful for that intervention, and I believe strongly in Northern Ireland's place as part of the internal market of the United Kingdom. And I've made clear repeatedly since I took up this position that I will support any measures that reinforce that, make that clear, but are also consistent with the international commitments the government has signed up to. If I could just pick it up on what he said initially, I'm not arguing at all for a majoritarian position. I'm not. I believe in power sharing. I am as wedded as the Secretary of State is to the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm making a point about the responsibility of politicians to participate in that power sharing arrangement. It's the responsibility. And I would make those remarks equally to those who have collapsed the institutions previously and the current cause of the collapse, because in the end it's not in the interests of Northern Ireland not to have a functioning government. If I could clarify that. I will give way and then I will finish.
Well, because he's raising a very important point. The whole point of the agreement and of power sharing is that it is based on consent. So how can the unionist community consent to law-making by the EU in which they do not participate and have no influence?
Very bad.
Well, the right honourable gentleman asks a very pertinent question, but it is a consequence, if I may respond, of a course of action that personally I didn't think was a terribly good idea, and he thought it was. And the moment we left the European Union, everybody knew there was going to be a problem that had to be addressed. There were really, to keep that open border, there were only two practical propositions. The first was the right honourable member for Maidenhead, the former Prime Minister, came up with a scheme to try and keep the whole of the UK within the arrangements of the single market, having announced we were leaving the single market, and that didn't work out. And the second option was to do the same in respect of Northern Ireland. So it is where we are. And the government eventually negotiated the Windsor framework, which is an important step forward. These things are going to have to be worked through. The question is whether the operation of the green lane, because that is really what we're talking about. Everybody agrees with the red lane. If goods are coming into Northern Ireland to then head off to the Republic, well, of course they should be checked. And that's what the red lane is for. So what we're debating is the operation of the green lane. Question, does it really make sense for there to be no power-sharing government institutions, no assembly, no executive in Northern Ireland because of a debate and an argument about the operation of the green lane? Well, my view very strongly is that is not sufficient a reason not to have a functioning government. And I would just conclude by saying the people of Northern Ireland have been waiting long enough, and now is the time for everyone to get back to work.
Yeah. Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.